Alright, what's going on, guys? I think it's fair to say that over the last 2 years, if there's one game that's been as close to perfection as possible, it's Elden Ring. It really was the culmination of everything FromSoftware learned over their decades of experience, packaged into one unforgettable adventure. And it's hard to even imagine that the game could have been even more perfect, had FromSoftware not been forced to sacrifice a few elements to get the game out on time, which is something that's been proven to be true and acknowledged by the team themselves, and something we can observe through the work done by those who study the files of the game and can uncover what exactly was cut that ended up missing from the final release. And none of those absences leave as big a hole as covenants. Now, we've briefly addressed this topic many times here on the channel, mainly in regards to multiplayer, but what I want to showcase today and discuss and take a deep dive into is just how much of an integral role covenants could have played in this game, and how Elden Ring was built from the ground up with the idea in mind, but also how they could have fundamentally transformed it and given Elden Ring an even longer lasting impact than it already had. But as we get into that today, if you enjoy all things Elden Ring, Armored Core, and FromSoftware, and want to stay up to date on the news, lore, and general discussion, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and now let's get into it. The story of Elden Ring revolves around the squabbles between the demigods, the children of Queen Marika, who inherited the great runes, the shards of the Elden Ring. This eventually led to a war known as the Shattering, a fight over territory across the lands between, where they broke off into their own respective factions, each claiming different regions, and flying banners to represent their alliances. Now, in the time leading up to Elden Ring's release, when all we had to work with was marketing for the game, the Shattering War and these factions were a big point of discussion, when we were gradually drip-fed little bits of information and lore about our characters and who they represented. We learned about the Carians and Liurnia and the different schools of sorcery, about the Redmanes and the war in Caelid, hints about a Lord of Blood that hid underground, and as we played the closed network test, we learned that each of these people had followers, and items told us about the many factions of those followers devoted to their masters. And in the early parts of the game, you can find many of these people, and they'll sway you to join their side. You even have the ability to become some of these followers, such as a recusant with the quest line for Volcano Manor, where you would theoretically serve Rykard, and you can also do Vare's quest line, which gives you an invitation to become a Bloody Finger and meet the Lord of Blood in person at his palace. But what you may notice if you do these quest lines in Elden Ring is that they lead to nothing more than dead ends. You don't actually get to be in service to these bosses, and the only length of you joining this faction is getting an item that allows you to invade under a different title, but the function is exactly the same, and there's no reward for doing so. But why wouldn't the player assume that there would be, when all throughout the history of the franchise and FromSoftware's catalog, covenants were a staple, where the player could side with the bosses in the game to unlock secret quest lines and rewards that engaged with all the features that the game provided. Covenants did a lot in expanding the game's story and making the world feel alive. It really did a lot in the way of making the events in the game's story feel as though they were happening in real time. Now, yes, the point of Elden Ring's story is to look back on the bygone age and do away with the things that have now gone to ruin, so that we can usher in a new age, but I don't think that's a big enough excuse for the player to not be able to earn any of the demigods' favors, especially when there's already a quest line that hints throughout the entire process that that's exactly what we're doing. The Pureblood Knight's Medal, which is the item that allows you to travel to Mohgwyn Palace, has a description that reads, "Proof that one is a glorious knight of the new dynasty of Mohgwyn that the Lord of Blood will inaugurate. Used to be granted audience with Mohg, only it is not yet time, for Mohg yet slumbers beside the divinity. Be patient, the new dynasty is nigh." Every bit of that wording suggests that we would be going to Mohg with the intent of joining his forces. And so when I got to this point on my first playthrough, I was so confused why it initially started a boss fight. Now, yes, our goal in the game is to take out all the demigods and collect the great runes, but both Mohg and Rykard are optional bosses, and we've had instances in the past, such as with Gravelord Nito, where you could join a covenant of a required boss fight. It just seems like they cut the end of these quest lines due to time constraints. And that does seem to be the case, because in the files there are rank systems tied to these covenant items. And those ranks would have been a very good addition to the game, because as it stands right now, without them there is no incentive to playing multiplayer. Now, yes, of course fun is a factor in that, but if you want to engage with the game's world and play the role of a recusant or Bloody Finger, the game does not recognize that, and when the player comes to realize it, it's pretty immersion breaking. Now, the Colosseums do remedy this at least a little bit, but not enough to give the player that sense of accomplishment or to fill the holes in the story left by the absence of covenants. It's just not enough to get people to play it. it, especially when the multiplayer covenants of the past were so good and had such an addicting gameplay loop, as well as a social aspect that brought the world to life. The Forest Hunters Covenant was one of the best at doing this. It turned an already interesting area in Darkroot Garden into a convergence between worlds, allowing players to take the role of NPCs, earn cool rewards, and build upon their own story as well as the story of the players they invade outside of the standard gameplay. It was a really magical gameplay feature that helped build a community that's just missing entirely in Elden Ring. And the unfortunate part is that the world and game of Elden Ring is more primed than ever for this exact type of thing. Like we already talked about, the world of Elden Ring is already split into factions, divided by regions that have very established borders and affiliations. But what would the covenants of Elden Ring actually look like? Well, we've already established the Recusants and the Bloody Fingers. They'd be working alongside Mohg and Rykard, engaging in basic invasion PvP. Another potential candidate is an Erdtree defense faction, kind of like how the Forest Hunters defend Darkroot Garden. This covenant could invade newcomers to Lane Dell. The Dragon Cult is also an enigmatic part of the lore that would have been a great candidate to be fleshed out further, and was also a staple covenant in all of the Dark Souls games. It could very easily function as it always has in the past. A Carian Knight covenant would make a lot of sense to guard Caria Manor, and would be a good point in the game to introduce players to PvP, while also being a natural gateway to the reward of Ronnie's questline. It would also fill in the hole of a repeat boss as well. Fia's Champion would have been a great covenant, as the boss fight already clones player models. They could have very easily had this just summon a player that's in the covenant to take the role of one of the champions. Honestly, even if it's not a covenant, I'm not sure why the boss fight didn't go that way to begin with. The Halig Tree also makes a ton of sense to be a defense-based covenant. Perhaps you could join the ranks of the Cleanrot Knights, with one of the statues or even Melania herself being your place to return your tokens. And finally, we would need a lore-accurate covenant for the cooperative spirits, and I think one of the churches of America would make a great place to be that covenant's home base. So to wrap all of this up under one big umbrella, I think the choice to scrap covenants from Elden Ring was one of the biggest mistakes, and also one of the only mistakes I think FromSoftware made when creating Elden Ring. You can really feel the big hole left where they would have been, especially when it comes to the quest lines with no resolution, and the big lack of reason to engage with the game's multiplayer. Covenants evolved a lot between Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, and it was such a massive opportunity to flesh them out in Elden Ring, but for whatever reason, this was the one element that met the chopping block. But I am curious, if you had the opportunity to add any covenant to Elden Ring, what would you create? I look forward to reading y'all's thoughts down in the comments section below. Anyways though guys, that's gonna pretty much do it for the video today. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave a like on it and subscribe if you're new around here. But with all that, I will catch you in the next one.